I used to think beach houses were peaceful. The ocean breeze, the sound of waves, and being away from the city felt perfect. But after what happened in the summer of 2019, I'll never stay in a beach cabin again. My friend Ethan invited me and two others, Jake and Lucas, to his family's beach house in Oregon. It was secluded, right on the shore, surrounded by dunes and trees. The first 2 days were perfect. Bonfires, late-night talks, and drinks. But on the third night, things got weird. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a soft, rhythmic tapping on my window. At first, I thought it was a branch or a bird, but when I looked, there was nothing, just darkness. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The tapping had stopped. I convinced myself it was just the wind and went back to sleep. The next night, at exactly 3 a.m., it happened again. This time, it was louder, deliberate, like fingers tapping on the glass. I shot up, staring at the window. Nothing. No branches, no birds. Just the blackness outside. The next morning, I mentioned it, expecting laughs, but Jake's face went pale. "You heard it too?" he asked. We joked about the place being haunted, but no one really found it funny. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept staring at the window, waiting. At exactly 3 a.m., the tapping returned. This time, I forced myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the window. The glass was fogged from the ocean air, but I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were fingerprints on the outside of the glass. They were fresh, smudged slightly, like someone had just pulled their hand away. Then I saw it. A figure stood on the beach, just beyond the porch light. It wasn't moving. It wasn't walking. It was just standing there, facing the house. I couldn't see details, just a dark silhouette against the sand. I backed away, heart hammering. I wanted to wake the others, but I was afraid that if I looked away, it would be gone. Or worse, closer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I aimed it at the beach. Nothing. The figure was gone. The next morning, I told Ethan and Lucas. Lucas looked uneasy, but Ethan shrugged. "It's probably some local messing with us," he said. I wanted to believe him. Then Jake came down, looking worse than me. "I heard it again," he muttered. "But this time, it was louder." We looked at each other, all thinking the same thing. It was getting closer. That night, we locked every door, shut every window, and kept the porch light on. I stayed up, gripping my phone like a weapon. At exactly 3 a.m., the tapping came back. But this time, it wasn't just on the window. It was on the walls, the front door. It was coming from everywhere. I bolted upright, heart pounding. I could hear it, fingernails, knuckles, palms slapping against the glass, the wood. the doorknob rattling. Then, for the first time, I heard something worse. A voice, low, whispering, right outside my window. Let me in. I turned on my flashlight. The tapping stopped immediately. I ran out of my room, nearly crashing into Jake, who was shaking. "You heard it too?" he gasped. Ethan and Lucas stumbled out of their rooms, clearly freaked out. "The doors," Ethan stammered. "The doors were rattling." We grabbed anything that could be used as a weapon. We didn't know what we were up against, but we weren't going to wait for it to get inside. We stayed awake until dawn, huddled in the living room. The tapping never came back, but we never went back to sleep either. At sunrise, we packed and got ready to leave. Before we left, we checked around the cabin. That's when we saw them. Footprints, hundreds of them, surrounding the entire house. Some were normal-sized, others were small, bare feet, leading up to every window, stopping just beneath the glass, like something, or many things, had been watching us. We never told Ethan's parents the full story. We just said we wanted to leave early. I don't know if they ever experienced anything after that, but I'll tell you this. None of us ever went back, and I'll never stay in a beach cabin again. I've worked for the Coast Guard for over 10 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things at sea. Boats disappearing without a trace, wrecks turning up miles from where they should be. But nothing comes close to what happened in the fall of 2018. This isn't just another maritime mystery. This is something else. Something terrifying. The disappearance. It started with the Eleanor, a 28-foot fishing boat owned by 3 experienced fishermen, Mark Simmons, Dan Calloway, and Jason Reed. They set out on what was supposed to be a routine overnight trip. The weather was clear, the water calm. There was no reason for concern. But then, just before midnight, we got a distress signal. The radio transmission was full of static, but we could make out heavy breathing, shuffling sounds, and then a single word, garbled, stretched by interference, but unmistakable. Help. Then, silence. We dispatched search teams immediately. Over the next few days, we covered hundreds of square miles. We found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, not even a life jacket. It was like the Eleanor and its crew had vanished into thin air. After a week, the search was called off. Their families mourned, but deep down, I think they still hoped the men might come back someday. 7 months later, they got their wish. The return. A local fisherman spotted something drifting just outside the harbor at dawn. When he got closer, he nearly capsized his boat in fear. It was the Eleanor, but the boat looked wrong. The hull was coated in algae, barnacles clung to its sides, and the paint was peeling as if it had been submerged for months. It shouldn't have been floating. But the worst part, there was no one on board. We towed the Eleanor back to the dock, a mix of dread and disbelief creeping over us. When we climbed aboard, it felt like stepping into a ghost story. Everything was still in place. The fishing gear was untouched, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table, and even a jacket was draped over a chair, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. But there were signs, horrible signs, that something had gone terribly wrong. The cabin walls were covered in scratches, long, deep grooves, like someone had been clawing at them in desperation. The cushions on the seats were slashed open, and the floor was covered in dark stains. We tested them later. Human blood. And then we found the notebook. The final entry. It started off normal: weather reports, fish counts, small notes about their trip. Then the handwriting changed. The neat, organized script turned frantic, uneven. The last few entries sent a chill down my spine. Something is under us. We hear it knocking at night. The water isn't right. It moves when the air is still. It's whispering to us. Dan is gone. He walked to the edge and just disappeared. We didn't see him fall. We heard something splash, but the water was flat. Jason won't speak anymore. He just stares. I hear voices now, calling my name. It's inside. That was the last entry. The unanswered questions. We searched the Eleanor for days, looking for any clue as to what happened, but there was nothing. No sign of the men, no indication of where the boat had been. The Coast Guard classified it as an unsolved disappearance. But I know, deep in my gut, that this was something else. Something beyond logic. To this day, the Eleanor sits in a storage facility, locked away from the public. I pass by it sometimes, and every time, I get the same feeling. I've worked as a lifeguard for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last summer. It was a calm, sunny afternoon at the lake. The kind of day where everything seems peaceful. Almost too peaceful. The lake was a popular spot, mostly for families and locals who wanted to escape the heat. I had been on duty since early morning, watching over swimmers. At around 3 p.m., a man I hadn't seen before arrived. He was in his late 20s or early 30s, tall, lean, with sun-bleached hair. He seemed normal enough, just another visitor looking for a way to cool off. He dropped his towel near the shore, stretched his arms, and walked straight into the water without hesitation. I remember watching him because he had this strange confidence about him, like he'd been swimming there his whole life. He waded out to about chest-deep water, floated on his back for a while, then suddenly turned over and swam toward the deeper part of the lake. A few minutes later, I lost sight of him. I scanned the lake, expecting him to resurface, but he didn't. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. A full minute. Still nothing. Panic set in. I blew my whistle and jumped from my post, running toward the water as I shouted for the other lifeguards. The lake wasn't deep in that section. maybe 8 feet at most. If he was in trouble, he should have been able to push himself up, or at least flail his arms. But there was no movement, no bubbles, no struggle. Just silence. We dove in, searching the area where he was last seen. The water was murky, but visibility was good enough to see a few feet ahead. We combed the area, first in small circles, then wider. 5 minutes passed, then 10. There was no sign of him. It was like he had never been there. By this point, the beachgoers were watching, whispering. A few offered to help, but I told them to stay back. We called the police, and within minutes, divers were in the water. I watched anxiously as they scoured the entire lake. If he had drowned, his body should have been somewhere. But after 2 hours, they found nothing. Not even a shred of clothing or a floating limb. It didn't make sense. The authorities eventually expanded the search area, dragging the lake with sonar and even checking the shorelines for any sign that he had somehow climbed out and wandered off. But the more they searched, the stranger it became. No one had seen him leave the water. There were no footprints leading away from the lake, no discarded clothes or personal items except the towel he had left behind. And even that was strange. There was no wallet, no keys, no phone. Just a plain white towel. The lake was calm again, almost too calm, as if nothing had happened. That night, after the search was officially suspended, I stayed behind, staring out at the water. The sun was setting and the lake looked more ominous than ever, dark and endless. I felt this heavy silence pressing down on me, like something was watching. Then I heard it. A faint splash far out in the water. It wasn't loud, but distinct enough that I knew something had disturbed the surface. I turned toward the sound, scanning the lake. My gut told me to leave, but I couldn't. I stood there waiting, my heart pounding, and then I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure, floating just beyond the swim zone, barely visible in the dim light. The same tall, lean build. The same sun-bleached hair. He was just standing there, chest deep in the water, staring at me. I called out, but he didn't respond. I took a step forward, feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. Then, in an instant, he was gone. No ripples, no splash. He just vanished. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. But the lake was silent again, as if it had swallowed him whole. I left immediately, not daring to look back. That was the last time I worked at that lake. I quit the following week. The man was never found. No missing persons report was filed. No one ever came looking for him. It was as if he had never existed. And yet, sometimes, when I think back to that day, I wonder if he's still out there, drifting beneath the surface, waiting.